Welcome to the show, David. I'm going to do my
Thank you,
best
Loretta.
not to call you Hank. It's so
Right.
weird.
Well, if you call me Hank, I'll forgive you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So the book is Hank Hills, and I really enjoyed reading this book. What a wonderful author you are. You make it easy to follow through. So I'd like to start out by just talking about you for a little bit so that
Sure.
I'm sure my audience doesn't know who you are, right?
Right.
So when did you start writing and tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey? Yeah.
Oh, well, I started writing very young. I actually realized that writing was a special activity to me when I was 11 years old. Something happened to me that made me see that writing was something that I could learn from and grow with. And that was really an important moment for me. And then, I had thought I wanted to be a doctor because my father was a doctor. But when I
Oh.
took biology in ninth grade, I realized that wasn't going to happen. So actually, it was right after that, when I was 15 years old, that I decided I wanted to be a writer and I wanted to write books. But then, of course, it was a very long journey from there. Um, but really, I would say I've been a serious writer since I was 15 years old. And but I had the usual kind of apprenticeship that writers always had. I published some things in high school, but in the high school literary magazine. But then once I went to college, I didn't publish. I went to college at age 18, and I was seriously writing that whole time. And I didn't publish a word until I was, I think, 27 or 28. So I had 10 years of writing. I wrote 40 or 50 short stories. I wrote a novel that didn't get published. But then that was a kind of crisis for me, that not publishing that first novel. And I guess that was right when I was 27 years old. So that was a big deal in my life. And that was when I kind of turned things around and realized that I had to bring my writing closer to home. I guess I could elaborate on that if you'd like, Loretta.
I would love that. And I'm also thinking the age of 27. I'm not gonna keep talking about astrology, but that's a big point in people's lives, right?
It's a big age. Yes, it is. And I knew that at the time.
Wow.
So my father, who was a doctor, as I said, had died when I was 16 years old.
Oh.
And that was the major trauma in my life that I had to heal from. And, when I was 16, I was able to, of course, I knew intellectually that my father had died. He had leukemia, and we were told that he had leukemia about 6 months before he died, although he had known for 6 years. He had known, but my parents didn't want to tell me when I was that young, when I was just 10 years old. So I had, at the beginning of my writing career, when I studied with a writer who's very well known in the South at that time, and at Duke, Reynolds Price, and he was my writing mentor. And as soon as he began teaching us, he said, the most important thing in writing is to write from an emotional place, write something that's important to you emotionally. Mm-hmm. And as soon as he said that, I heard that with this feeling of dread, like, oh, I don't want to write about that. That's the one thing I don't want to write about. But I tried to do that a couple of times with him, and through the years. But when I was 27 years old, I had not published that first novel, I began to see a counselor, a therapist, really. And my presenting problem was that I'd done all this writing and I deeply wanted to be a writer, but it wasn't working out for me. Mm-hmm. But as soon as I told him something of my life story, he wanted to talk about this thing, about my father having died. And he suspected, we talked about what surrounded that, and he suspected that there was some wish to prove myself to my father that I'd never gotten to do, which I think was true. So we started to talk about that. But the very first thing that was really important to me is that when I talked about the circumstances of my father's death, he asked me to go off and write a letter to my father and tell him all the things that I'd never been able to tell him. Because not only had the circumstances been that I didn't see my father when he died, but I just wasn't able to do that when I was 16 years old. I was very conflicted and very angry about what was happening. I think anger was the thing I felt most strongly. So anyway, in those days, I was trying to write fiction and I wanted to get on with that. I didn't want to do what I thought was this stupid little self-help thing of writing this letter. And at that time, I was writing at the university library, at the Duke University Library, because my son was young and I couldn't write around the house. And I went to the fourth floor of the library to write this letter. And I wrote, "Dear Dad," at the top of the page, and I burst into tears. I had no idea that was going to happen. That was just a total shock. And I just felt all the grief from that. And so I stumbled off and found a place that was away from everything. And I continued to write that letter. And then I began to write about my father a lot, my relationship to my father, and about his death. And I realized that to write a good first novel, I needed to write about my father's death. And so my first novel, Football Dreams, is about a young man. It was just my story, basically. A young man who's trying to prove himself to his father by playing football, but his father dies before he's able to do that. He doesn't make the team. He doesn't make the varsity team until after his father has died. And that was my story, basically. So that was my first novel, and then I've gone on from there.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. What a journey. And there's so much honesty in that, and vulnerability also, David. But I think that, like you say, there's something about writing, right? And for you to be able to open yourself up in that way, that really does come through in your writing. I think that's what's appealing about reading your book is, like I said, it pulls you in. It's very intimate in its own right. But yeah, I've had these experiences. Like, I'm a journaler. Like, I love journaling and dream work and that kind of stuff. But I'm totally with you. That exercise where you're going to sit down and start writing, man, it just popped you right open.
Right. And I'm a big journaler too. And I think for me, that was something, I had another writing mentor, this man named Wallace Valley, who I met when I was also met when I was 18. And he told me to keep a journal and to write in my journal every day. And I promptly did not do that when I was 18 because I wanted to write fiction. And I thought, why am I going to, but once I started writing to publish, even though a lot of it wasn't published at first, I began to keep a journal, not only to keep track of things that were going on with my writing, but also to keep track of what was going on with me emotionally.
Right.
And that was always a track that ran alongside whatever I was writing, what was happening in my life now and what, had happened in my life before, which was often what I was writing about. In the case of Football Dreams, the thing that I really wanted to do my whole life was be a writer, much more than playing football. So I was kind of writing about that wish, and the wish, and I'll just say also, Loretta, that my father himself, although he was a doctor, had actually had a period of time in his life when he wanted to be a writer. So I was kind of that thing that Jung said, the young man lives out the life that his parent had wished they'd had. Yeah. And that was true for me as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I find a couple of things interesting about that, because we're going to talk about your book in just a little bit, and your dad being a doctor, and then you write a book about someone who heals with their hands. Yes. We'll get into that in just a minute. So how old were you when that first book was published?
I was 32.
Wow. Okay. So you had that span of
that
time.
long apprenticeship, let's say, from 15 or 18 until I was 32. I had published a few shorter pieces before that, but yeah, the first big national publication was when I was 32.
Yeah. Before we get too far into it, because I'm a kind of a firm believer that everybody's got their superpower, everybody have their gifts that they came, and you're really only going to be happy when you share them, when you figure that out. Like, what is your secret power and how do you do that? What advice would you give anybody listening that would be wanting to be an author, a published author, right? What would you say to them?
Well, I do think that, when I was young, I naturally wanted, fame and fortune and all those things. I wanted to be famous. I wanted everybody to love me.
Yeah.
And, but I, I soon realized as I was writing that that wasn't actually the reason I was writing, that there was a deeper reason that went back to what I saw when I was 11 years old. And that deeper reason has to do um, with touching into a part of yourself that you can only know through certain activities, through writing. Meditation has been another one for me, and that's of course a big theme in my book. But so if somebody comes to me and they talk to me about being a writer, one of the things I say to them, and it sounds stupid, but I say, well, how do you think you'll make a living? Because we all dream of making a living as a writer, and there were a few years when I was able to do that. But one of the things that's important is that someone understand that there's making a living, and then there's your true vocation. And although I've had huge ups and downs in my writing career, I mean, when you recite these titles from my biography, it sounds like, oh, it's been great the whole time, but it hasn't. I've had big ups and downs, periods when things didn't get published and periods when they did. And I've had to do other kinds of work. The teaching I did at Duke really had nothing to do with, I was teaching in the School of Public Policy and teaching grad students how to write a policy memo. But I did that because it gave me time to do the writing I really wanted to do. And the only kind of really bad spot in my writing career was when I needed to make money, but wasn't able to do it through writing, and I was kind of lost. So I think the thing that I would say to somebody is just keep focused on this true part of your vocation, which is what you're really doing. That's how you're learning about yourself, and keep that in mind, and don't worry. You can't help worrying about how your career is going, but don't let that be the central focus.
Yeah. I'm a musician, right? I've got a degree in piano performance, right?
Right.
So I'm paper trained heavily, as they say, right? But I remember studying about composers, and Charles Ives, as a composer, is a great composer.
Right.
And he chose somewhere along the line that he would not try to make his living being a composer. He would sell life insurance or something and make his money that way, so that when he composed, he could compose whatever it was that wanted to come out of him without feeling like he had to meet that prescriptive thing. And that's always stuck in my head.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
That's very
So
good.
yeah, so to be able to, in your case, I'm really hearing how you somehow freed yourself up in that. And then I did chuckle when you're saying you're teaching about writing policies. I went, oh, here's the dry thing over here, and then here's the delicious thing over here. But then that works out in that beautiful balancer, right?
Right. And
Yeah,
also learning to write a policy memo was very important to the students.
yeah.
So I was engaged in something that was important, and I was good at that, and I worked hard at it. But then when I had time to write for myself, I could do exactly what I wanted to do because I didn't have to make money that way. I wish I'd
Yeah.
started that, 20 years before I did.
Well, and thank you for that, because I really do mean it. If anybody's listening that would love to be an author or a writer, I think that talking to someone who's been through it can give you that advice. It's it's invaluable. There's no words for that. So do listen to that, and remember, you can go back and listen to this show again and write it down if you need to. Take a little sound clip and keep playing it in your head so that you've got it. Yeah. Um, I want to ask you, because this book, Hank Heals, you've got such a mix of Buddhism, Catholicism, all kinds of things in it. where are you spiritually, if you don't mind me asking that
Oh,
question?
no,
Okay.
no. So I grew up in a Christian household, but and that was important to me when I was young. And my father was an elder in the Presbyterian Church, and his religious life was very important to him. And that's something I've written about a lot. But and so I kind of had my ups and downs with Christianity as well. But I tried to come back to it when I was in my early 20s. I had kind of drifted away, and I really kind of, I don't know how to put it, worked at being a Christian for 5 or 6 years. And it somehow or other, I don't know if it partly had to do with my writing career, but I just couldn't get my mind around. I couldn't tell whether Christianity wasn't right for me or I wasn't right for Christianity. Sometimes it seemed the one thing and sometimes it seemed the other. And I think, honestly, Loretta, the truth of the matter was that at that time, I was a religious person without a religion.
Yeah.
And that's an unhappy person.
Yeah.
And I was also very defensive about it. So we're kind of two therapists in now. I'm with my third therapist in my mid-30s. And he brought up this thing that someone had mentioned to me, that they thought I was angry about religion. And angry about religion. I said, why would that be? And he just felt this from me a lot. But I do think, and I was very defensive and fussy. So then my first wife and I were divorced, and I'd met a new woman who was actually herself quite Catholic, but not like any Catholic I'd ever met. I grew up in Pittsburgh, which is a very Catholic town. It's very ethnic and Catholic. So I thought I knew what a Catholic was until I met this woman, and she had worked for this organization called Witness for Peace in El Salvador and Nicaragua. She was a Catholic social activist, and when we talked about religion, I couldn't get a handle on it, because I'd say, "Well, you believe this and this and this." She said, "No, I don't believe that. That's not what it's about for me." But I couldn't kind of get a handle on what she did believe, and then because her religion was very intuitive and personal. And I didn't know this at the time, but she'd also spent half her life studying Taoism. She was really interested in Taoism as well as Catholicism. So in any case, she decided she wanted to go to divinity school. And she wanted to step back from the work and go to divinity school. And she went to a Jesuit school, Weston School of Theology. And at that time, my son was a senior in high school. So she didn't ask me to come up and join her that first year. But then she transferred to Harvard the second year and asked me to come up. And she wanted us to have a spiritual practice in common. This was something because she felt there was this gulf between us. And I think just personally, she wanted that, but also because she was at divinity school and she didn't want to be there with this total heathen or whatever. So she suggested that we take a meditation class together. Yeah. And there was a center that was just a few blocks from our house, the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center. And I think when she said she wanted us to have a spiritual practice in common, I felt no such wish or such need, but it was one of those things where I did it because she wanted it. I didn't want to fight about it, So I went to this class, but it's this kind of angry, defensive person that's going into this class. And I was just all set to hear some, pious nonsense that I was going to object to and start arguing about it or something. But what happened was we were in this basement room and this man came down, kind of perfectly ordinary man, didn't look like some religious figure, talked to us a little bit about why we were there. And then he just started to talk about how to sit and how to follow your breathing. It was very simple instruction. And he said we were going to sit every week and we were going to sit a longer period of time every week. And he would like us to sit every day at home. And one of the things about me is that I've always been a dutiful student. I do the homework. If the teacher says sit every day at home, I sit every day at home. And so I began to do that. I a daily meditation practice at that time with no particular feeling that it was something I wanted to do, but I was in this class and I had to do it. I would also say, though, that this man that I met, who was Larry Rosenberg, who I later wrote 2 books with, somehow inspired confidence in me. I felt as if I knew him. And honestly, I know this is going to just sound like I made this up. He reminded me a little of my father. He was a very warm, affectionate person.
Yeah.
And so I began to practice, and we did the beginner's class, and then we did an intermediate class. And then my wife couldn't go on because she was very busy, but I took the intermediate class again, and that was as high as it went. Intermediate was the best you could be. And somewhere in that period of time, I would say in the first semester or maybe into the second, I realized that I had found something that I'd been looking for all my life.
Yeah.
And that I'd actually been looking for in Christianity and hadn't been able to find. And that was this way of connecting with something larger than myself. But I've already said this, and you'll know it as I'm saying it. The other place where I had found that was in my writing. And I kind of knew that. I had a hunch about that, but I wouldn't have put it in the way I've just put it now. I just had this feeling when things were looking bad for me and I wasn't getting anything published, and well-meaning people were kind of suggesting, well, I was teaching in a secondary school, and yeah, you do that well. The students like you. Why don't you just do that? There was something in me that knew, honestly, I just could not stop writing. And the way I would have put it is, if I stop writing, I'll die. And I think what I meant by that was that I needed to connect with this larger thing, deeper place, whatever you want to call it. And then once I found that in meditation as well, that kind of freed up my writing in a new way, because I could connect with that in meditation. And now I was free to write any way I wanted, or to write as much or as little as I wanted. I didn't have to do it. Whereas before, I'd had to do it. I would have walked through a brick wall. I just had to do what I had to do. But I no longer felt that way once my meditation practice was established, which took some time. I'm not talking about a short period of time now, weeks or months. I don't really remember, but that was 1991, and I've had a daily practice of meditation ever since then.
Wow. I can deeply relate to what you're saying, and I also love what you're saying. There, a lot of people come to me and they're always talking about something missing, wanting to make that deep connection. And
right.
I also, I call it laying next to the well, right? But it's that nurturing, or just that communion, or in that space. Like, none of the words really get to it, but that's my soft place to land. That's where
right.
Yeah. And I'm like you. For me, it's vitally important. Like, it's vitally important, especially because I work with so many people and do so much healing, channeling work and that kind of thing. And it's like, sometimes people say, well, Loretta, don't you get enough of that in your work? And I go, but I'm doing that with and for other people. And this is personal, to draw from that well for yourself, or to make that connection for yourself. And so finding what that is just, in my opinion, brilliant and wonderful. And writing and meditation. Yeah, I think that's great. We're going to stop right there and take a station break, Benny, if you're still around. And I want to remind everybody that my guest today is David Guy, and he is a wonderful author. His book, Hank Heals, a Novel of Miracles. We're really going to get into it, and it's a very unusual book because it is a spiritual fiction novel. It's kind of juicy. So don't go away, because when we get back, believe it or not, we're going to talk about things like faith and faith healing and sex. And yes, I did say that. Okay, we're going to take a station break. Be right back.
Cool. All clear. Still live on YouTube and all that. So if you want to still chat, that's fine.
Yeah, we're still live on YouTube.
Yep.
I have to tell you that I just talking to you is wonderful. Your openness, the way that you talk, really, and I mean this, I keep giving you compliments, but this is a very easy book to read. And I felt the layers in it. Like, how do I say this? The person observing the art, always has a response to what the artist has created, in your case, writing, right? Which evokes, but you write so well, it evokes these responses on the inside, right? So I'm
Mhm.
sure that me reading it, I've got my own life experience, which is going to somewhat flavor my experience, right? As opposed to somebody else reading it who may not,
Right.
um, as be, in the same place that I'm at.
Right.
So when you're writing, are you just casually writing? Are you purposely putting layers in there? Or is it just the gift of the artist? You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I think both things are going on at once. I mean, I've spent my whole life writing. I've spent my whole life reading. I've studied this. I've studied about different layers in work. But when I sit down to write, I mean, I think this would correspond to being a musician. You have a lot of technical things you have to learn, but then you just sit down and play. I mean, that's what you do. And you have to forget all that and just play. And I remember the jazz musician Charles Mingus said this thing I just loved. He said, "Learn your instrument and then play yourself." And so, yeah, those things I think are all true. And yet, when I'm writing the book, I'm just writing a book. I'm just trying to tell a good story, and I'm just saying, all right, what happens
Yeah.
next?
And I'm going to interrupt you, David. I got to bring you back on here, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
Stand by.
Just one thing, then I'll be okay. I need a miracle every day.
Woohoo! Yeah. Benny, Cosmic DJ. Thank you. I need a miracle every day. Anyway, welcome back to the original Loretta Brown Show. I am Loretta Brown. My guest today is David Guy. We're discussing his book, Hank Heals, a novel of miracles. I want to remind everybody that these shows are archived and you can download them for free and listen to them over and over again from the KKNW 1150 AM archives, as well as iTunes, Spotify, Podcast One, Twitter, YouTube, and all kinds of various and sundry places that surprised me this show has gone to. So please listen to this show over and over and research through, because I have all kinds of amazing people on my show. So let's talk about your book, David. Let's
Great.
talk about it. Hank Heals. Where did you get the idea for this story? And tell us about the title.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the place that I got the idea for the story was something that happened to me when I was young. And that was that I had this friend who, when I was 12 years old, so this would have been 1960, there were these faith healers on television, and we were making one in particular, and we were making fun of him at school. And one day, this guy, this friend of mine who I'd known since we were in day camp together, told me that he had been healed by a faith healer. He took me aside, and he wasn't, scolding me or something, but he said this had happened to him, and that when he was young, he had broken his ankle. The doctor had said it, but he continued, after he was supposedly cured, he continued to have a limp and to have pain. So they went back to the doctor. The doctor x-rayed it. He said, this is growing crookedly, and we're going to have to break it again. And his mother just didn't want to do that. And his mother, I never met his mother, but I know from who he was that she was a upper middle class woman, but she took her son to a faith healer on a radio show in Pittsburgh, and something happened and healed him. The limp disappeared, the pain disappeared. And since you've read my book, I've put this story right into the middle of a book with a different person happening to. But when this happened, I could tell he didn't want me to tell any of my friends, and I never did. But I went home and talked to my father. And my father said, that woman preys on poor people and to get their money, and this couldn't have happened. So I had this thing where my friend had said one thing to me and my father had said another thing to me, and my father was a religious person. But it's one of those things where you have to carry both those things together. And I carried that, for 60 years or whatever. And I wrote about it on one other occasion, but I'd written an earlier novel about Hank called Jake Fades. And in that novel, novel is about what we call in Buddhism transmission, Jake passing the teaching on to Hank. But this novel is about the teacher dying. And now, if I've told you my life story, what an important moment this is for me. And I think that that's a moment when the teacher, this man needs to heal. So I had this title, Jake Fades, though I thought of the title, Hank Heals. And as soon as I thought of that title, I thought, wait a minute, what does that mean? And what might be another way to look at that? And this is the first time in my life that the title gave me the idea for the novel. Yeah. And so I thought, what if I write a book where, because I'd certainly, I'd meditated, I know that it involves energy, and, I felt the healing energy of meditation for as long as I've been doing it. And suddenly I thought, I know that that healing energy exists. And I know that various, spiritual figures have been said to have it. Krishnamurti, who is somebody I've read a lot, and apparently had healing powers, which people have credited. Vimala Thakar said he healed her from an inner ear infection that was life-threatening, as I remember. So it just occurred to me that I ought to explore this. And I had this story from the past that I could put in. And in this novel, I think I keep both sides there. As somebody said to me, one of my first readers said to me, Hank is skeptical about his powers. Julie, his girlfriend, is convinced that he has the powers, and the reader isn't sure. And that's how I like to keep it, because that uncertainty is the same uncertainty I have about ever since this thing happened to me when I was 12 years old.
I love this so much because I'm a Reiki practitioner, among lots of other hats. And when we study the history of Reiki through a Buddhist lineage, right? Mm-hmm. A Buddhist lineage, we do talk about how Mikao Yasui was studying Zen Buddhism and wanted to know the meaning to life. What's the meaning of life? And his master sent him to meditate and pray. And what happened was that he had some sort of an experience where he was not seeking a way of, quote, healing. He was seeking enlightenment, and it came through as a byproduct.
Right.
And, as a byproduct. And so I'm reading your book and I'm like, you are so spot on with everything that you've got in this book. And it's a fictional book, but it was delightful for me to read because I could relate to a lot of the things in there.
Well, I read up on Reiki, among other things, before I wrote the book. Yeah.
Yeah, I bet you did. And there's also this really interesting, I'm going to say juggling act, because you're absolutely right. Like, is Hank really healing, or is it the Virgin Mother, right?
Right.
Because she's really in this story. So is it faith? Is it energy? What is it?
Right. And, the Virgin Mother, of course, comes from my wife's Catholicism, as I've said now, but also she, for many years, we went to Mexico and she collected images of the Virgin. Yeah. And so we had, through the years, we've probably had 30 of these things. She's sometimes given them away. But we still have them all over our house. And and through the years, we've heard so many stories of just miraculous healing of ordinary people in the contemporary world. So again, that's one of those situations, as when I was 12 years old. What do you make of that? But it fascinates me.
Yeah, it fascinates me too. And I've been doing running Reiki Oasis for almost 30 years, right? So I have a lot of those stories.
Right.
And there are many, many times when even I am like, because we don't do anything. Reiki practitioners admit they don't do anything. It's just what works through. But also, I also know that the receiver of that energy might be playing a role into that also with faith or belief or hope or who knows what. Like it's hard to know where to draw those lines.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and when my friend who was healed, what he said to me was, I didn't have faith. I didn't know what faith was. I was just a little kid. But little kids have faith. I mean, his mother took him somewhere. This woman spoke to him, and he had that childlike faith, which, Jesus, among other people, said is what we need to have. And so, in a certain sense, he didn't have, some belief in some doctrine, but he may have had faith.
Yeah. You also bring out some really important things in this book in interesting ways. And one of them is touch, the importance of touch and what touch
Right.
is all about. Like Hank touched her, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then you have other kinds of touch. You have massage touch and you have sexual touch and talk about touch for a little bit and then slide into talking a little bit about sexual energy because people
Right.
get uncomfortable, but it's a powerful energy. So yeah.
I know people get uncomfortable when you mention sex and religion in the same book. That's come up. So touch was very important to me because when one of the things that happened at that period of time when I was in my healing from my father's death, which actually happened in my 30s, and I was seeing that therapist. I was also seeing a massage, a woman who did body work, and then continuing to do that as I began to meditate. And what had happened when I couldn't handle my father's death emotionally was that I had tightened in my body. And I just made myself tight, especially through my torso. I'm sure you've dealt with this a lot. And so I wouldn't feel the emotions that I was afraid of. So really, I would say that this whole process was a process of my body coming alive. All through my 30s and into my 40s. And that was what really happened to me with meditation. In therapy, I understood what had happened, but in meditation, my body was just like a garden that was sprouting flowers. But through that whole process, massage was really important to me. And it's odd to speak of learning things through massage. I mean, I think people don't always understand what you mean, but I learned a lot about myself through massage. And it was just a very important part of the process. I just think touch has been very important to me in my life and in my healing process.
Well, I, as a body worker, right, as well as a spiritual counselor, do a lot of hats in there, but that mind-body connection. And also I'm convinced that a lot of people are disconnected from their bodies, or they don't spend enough time trying to figure out, okay, how do I feel, or what happens to me if I am touched there? And sometimes it's just someone holding your hand. You talk a lot about the rubbing of the belly, which is, yeah, very important.
Yes.
And yeah. And the cosmic mudra, right?
Right. And the belly is the seat of so much emotion. So what one Zen teacher told us is that that anger is up around the heart region, and sadness is below that in the belly, and then fear is further down, like in the lower belly. And that often what we do, fear is the most uncomfortable thing to feel. So we'd rather feel anger, we'd rather feel sorrow, and those can all be part of it. But what I discovered, when I was really going through meditation and long retreats and getting into my father's death, was that the final thing I needed to face was the fear I felt, because I was afraid our family just could not hold together. We wouldn't make it. And truth be told, I mean, we had some problems, and it was difficult, but we did get through it. And so, but facing that fear was kind of the final thing. I went through the anger, I went through the sorrow, and then the fear.
Yeah, and I want to get back to sex in a minute, but I want to make a comment. What I really liked in this book too was how Hank just kept going, do I really have this power in my hands? And everybody's like, yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. Like, I don't know, because he lives inside there and he can't feel what they're feeling. And I've kind of decided I want all my Reiki students to read your book, right? Because it opens up all of these discussions about things, and it's a really good segue in. But you do talk a lot about sexual energy, and you bring that openly into the book, and I want to say thank you for that, because like I said, it is like, what is this doing in this spiritual novel? And so talk for just a moment about sexual energy.
Sure. Well, when you're in that situation where you've tightened your torso up and you're holding off emotion for one reason or another, the only way you get to what we might call ecstasy is through sex. I mean, it's like there's a disconnect. You've got an active brain and an active penis, but you don't connect the two. They're not connected. There's no connection there. And
The two
so
heads
if
are not
that's
together.
right,
Gotta get your heads together. Okay.
if that's your only way to ecstasy, then that becomes an addictive practice because it's what you have to do. It's just like what I was saying about writing before. If that's it, so, and that's your way to connect. So I think Hank's situation is that he went through the same thing. I've written about Hank in other books, but he went through the same thing. And so in this situation, he is apparently the healer of Julie, but Julie becomes his healer because she's showing him that he doesn't have to be afraid of sexual expression, which he was. He was just staying away from it, but he can do it in a way that is not addictive and not compulsive. And if I, not many people have seen this in the book, but if you look at it that way, that he's her teacher and she's his teacher, you see her bringing him along slowly and carefully. And, I think it's very instinctive on her part, but, just if you, not being able to be a sexual being is like not being able to be an emotional being. You need to have all of that together. And so that, even though it may make people uncomfortable to have this in a supposedly spiritual book, I think, I've written a book about sex and spirituality as well. This book, The Red Thread of Passion, that was something I wrote after I began meditating because I was trying to bring these two parts of my life together.
Well, you have I'm going to quote something out of your book, and all it is this very small thing you wrote. It's all healing if you use it in the right way.
Right.
And that is there, because we have so many aspects of ourselves that need healing. And so, it's kind of jump in there. So we're almost out of time. I'm like, wait a minute. I got so many things I want to talk about.
I know.
Yeah. So in the last minute and a half, right? Tell us what do you really want people to get from this book? And I also want to say that this book, the last part of the book, especially the end of the book, I absolutely loved how you kind of, Hank goes off on kind of a self-discovery thing and has quite the experience and ends up coming back to himself in some way. So what is it you really want people to get from this book, and where can people find you? We've got 1 minute.
Well, what I think I want people to get from this book is, although it seems to be about the subject of faith healing, what it's really about is Hank healing. It's the thing I started off with, and that scene you're talking about at the end is the ultimate scene of Hank's healing. So it looks like it's about this other thing, but it's really about the healing that he does himself. And I've been writing about all that for years. I have a website if people are looking, davidguy.org, which is where I do a lot of writing and have posted a lot of writing and talk a lot about this book and my other books.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being on my show today, David Guy. I want to call you Hank. And the book is Hank Heals, a novel of miracles. I'm telling you right now, please, everybody just go get it. It's such a wonderful read. And I think it just raises all kinds of discussions and dialogues about spirituality, sexuality, and what is our true purpose? What are we here for? What's our superpowers? So everybody enjoy the week, and happy birthday, all my lovely Capricorn friends. Thank you. Thanks, David.